Your parents, Susan and Mark, are coming this weekend. They'll be staying for about a week, so you'll need to start planning the meals. Those were the very first words my husband said to me the moment we got home from the hospital. Not, how are you feeling? Not, does your incision still hurt? Not even, are you glad to be home? Just a reminder about the next family visit, as if the last 3 days had never happened. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 56 years old, and for the past 28 years, I've worked as a high school librarian in Central Ohio. I've always been the kind of person who remembers every birthday, notices when someone is struggling before they even say a word, and quietly takes care of everyone around me. Looking after people never felt like a burden. To me, that was simply what love looked like. My husband, David, is 58. He's a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, and we've been married for nearly 30 years. David wasn't a bad husband. He worked hard, loved our kids, paid the bills, and everyone respected him. His flaw was much smaller than that. So small, neither of us noticed it growing. He just became so used to me taking care of everything that eventually he stopped seeing the work behind it. Our son, Ethan, was coming home from college for the summer, and our daughter, Lily, was married and living a few states away. Like so many families, every holiday, every birthday, every visit eventually centered around our house, and more often than not, around my kitchen. I never minded, at least not until 2 weeks ago. David wanted to host a backyard barbecue for his clients and coworkers. I agreed, just like I always did. The only problem was I'd been dealing with a dull ache in my lower abdomen for 2 days. While I was prepping the food, David noticed me pressing a hand against my stomach. He said, "You don't have to do all this if you're not feeling well." I smiled without thinking and said, "I'll be fine." Looking back, those 4 words carried our entire marriage. So I kept going. I cooked, I welcomed the guests, and I smiled through the pain until the last car drove away. Before we went upstairs that night, David kissed my forehead and said, "Everything went perfectly. I couldn't have done it without you." I smiled and told him, "I know." About an hour later, I collapsed on the bathroom floor. The pain was so intense I couldn't stand. David rushed me to the emergency room, and a CT scan showed my appendix was severely inflamed. The surgeon looked straight at me and said, if you'd waited even a few more hours, it very likely would have ruptured. I remember just staring at him, not because I was scared, but because the first thought that crossed my mind was who was going to clean up after the barbecue. Even lying in a hospital bed, I was still worrying about everyone else. The surgery went well, and 3 days later I was discharged with one very clear instruction: no housework, no lifting, and 3 weeks of recovery. The nurse smiled as she handed me the papers and said, "Let your family take care of you for a change." I smiled back and said, "I'll try." I honestly believed I would. When we got home, I eased myself into a chair while David carried in my overnight bag. Then he glanced at the calendar on the refrigerator. His voice was completely casual when he said, "Oh, I almost forgot. My parents, Susan and Mark, are coming this weekend. They'll probably stay about a week." I waited. I honestly thought he was about to ask if we should postpone the visit. Instead, David looked at me and said, "It's only an appendix. You'll probably be feeling a lot better by then." For a second, I couldn't breathe, let alone think of something to say, so I looked away. Not because I was angry, but because I knew if I looked at him for 1 second longer, I was going to cry. He wasn't trying to hurt me. That was the hardest part. He genuinely believed what he was saying. To David, it was simple common sense. To me, it was the first crack in something I'd spent nearly 30 years believing could never break. That night, I couldn't sleep. David was already upstairs, fast asleep. I stayed on the living room couch because climbing the stairs still pulled at my stitches. The plastic hospital bracelet was still around my wrist, and I just turned it over and over beneath the glow of the television. For the first time in almost 30 years of marriage, I didn't cry. I simply lay there in the dark, asking myself one question. Had everyone become so used to me always being okay that no one had stopped to ask if I actually was? If you've ever been the person everyone depends on, then you probably know this exact feeling. People don't stop appreciating you all at once. It happens little by little until one day they simply assume you'll always be there to pick up the pieces. Lying on my couch that night with fresh stitches across my abdomen, I couldn't stop replaying David's words over and over in my head. It's only an appendix. He wasn't trying to be cruel, and honestly, that was what made it hurt the most. After almost 30 years of marriage, I realized my husband no longer wondered whether I could carry the weight. He simply assumed I always would. As I stared up at the dark ceiling, memories started flooding back. Not dramatic or terrible ones, just hundreds of tiny, quiet moments that had shaped our marriage. Every summer, usually in late June, David's family came to stay with us for about a week. It was his parents, his sister Susan with her husband Mark, and their 2 kids. Sometimes one of the kids even brought a friend along. 7 people altogether. It was always enough to fill the house with laughter, endless conversations, and a mountain of dirty dishes. Over the years, everyone came to love that tradition, including me. At least, I thought I did. Without even realizing it, I'd become the invisible machine that made those visits possible. I knew David's father, Richard, only drank decaf after his doctor warned him about his blood pressure. Susan had switched to almond milk years ago. Their oldest son, Tyler, had a severe peanut allergy, so I spent hours checking every single dessert label before buying it. None of that felt difficult at the time. When you love people, you remember the little things. That's just what you do. But the strange part wasn't everything I managed to remember. It was everything no one else remembered about me. No one remembered that I only drank Earl Grey tea. Every Christmas, someone would buy me coffee, and I'd just thank them anyway. No one remembered that I absolutely hate mushrooms. Every family casserole somehow found its way onto my plate, and I'd quietly pick them out without saying a word. One year, everyone remembered David's birthday, Richard's birthday, Susan's, and even Mark's. Mine came just 3 days later, and nobody mentioned it. Not until our daughter Lily called from North Carolina that evening and asked, "Mom, why do you sound so quiet?" I just smiled into the phone and said, "Oh, everyone's just tired after the weekend." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The memory that stayed with me the longest happened one summer morning. I'd been up since 6 o'clock making a massive breakfast. By the time everyone sat down, I realized I hadn't even poured myself a cup of tea. Everyone wandered downstairs, still sleepy and smiling, and filled their plates. Richard smiled and said, "This is the best breakfast I've had in months." David laughed proudly and added, "Claire always makes everyone feel at home." Everyone nodded and smiled, and then they went right back to talking about vacation plans and baseball scores. No one looked at me. No one asked if I'd eaten. I don't think anyone meant to ignore me, but the sad part was I'd stopped expecting them to notice. I just kept pouring orange juice into empty glasses. After everyone else finished, I finally sat down alone. That evening, after cleaning the kitchen and running the dishwasher, I opened the refrigerator to find nothing left but half a container of plain yogurt. I peeled back the lid, grabbed a spoon, and ate it standing right there in front of the refrigerator light. I remember smiling, not because I enjoyed yogurt for dinner, but because it honestly never occurred to me that I deserved anything different. That was just how those visits ended. Everyone else went to bed full, and I finished whatever was left. A few days after my surgery, our son Ethan came home from college for the summer. He had just turned 22, and living away from home had changed him. He still hugged me the moment he walked through the door and called me mom in that same little boy voice, but now he actually noticed things. The morning after he arrived, Ethan sat quietly at the kitchen table while I packed snacks for David's parents before they left for the farmer's market. I moved slowly because every stretch pulled hard at my stitches. Ethan didn't say a word. He just watched. Later that afternoon, I carried folded towels upstairs one at a time because I wasn't supposed to lift anything heavy. Again, he just stood there and watched. That evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, the two of us sat together on the back porch. The air was warm and the cicadas were loud enough to cover the heavy silence between us. Finally, Ethan looked over at me and asked, "Mom, when Dad's family comes to visit, do you ever actually get to rest?" I let out a quiet, tired laugh, not because it was funny, but because no one had ever asked me that in my entire life. I looked out into the dark backyard, shrugged, and said, "I guess I'm just used to it." The words came out naturally, almost automatically. But the moment I said them, I saw something shift in Ethan's face. For the first time in his life, my son wasn't looking at me as the superhuman mother who could handle everything. He was looking at me as a woman who'd been carrying an invisible weight for far too long. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Ethan and I stayed out on the back porch a little longer. The summer air was warm, and the steady hum of crickets drifted in from the trees behind our house. For a long time, neither of us said a word. It completely reminded me of when Ethan was little. Whenever something was bothering him, he'd never rush into talking. He would just sit quietly beside me until he finally found the courage to say what was on his mind. Apparently, some things never change. Finally, Ethan broke the silence, calling out softly, "Mom?" I looked over at him and said, "Yeah?" He hesitated for a few long seconds before asking the last question I ever expected to hear. "Have you ever thought about divorcing Dad?" I couldn't help but let out a short laugh, not because it was ridiculous, but because it caught me completely off guard. I turned toward him, shook my head, and told him no. Ethan looked genuinely surprised and asked, "No?" I just smiled softly and repeated, "No." He waited for an explanation, so I gave him the honest truth. I told him, "Your father is a good man, Ethan. I know people say that all the time as a cliché, but I actually mean it. He's worked incredibly hard for this family. He's always come home, and he made sure you and Lily had everything you ever needed growing up. I've never once doubted that he loves me." Ethan didn't interrupt. He just listened closely. After a long pause, he asked quietly, "Then what makes you so sad?" That question really hung in the air for a moment, because the truth wasn't something I'd ever actually put into words before. I leaned back, looking out into the darkness beyond our yard, and admitted that I'd been asking myself that very same thing ever since the surgery. Another quiet moment passed before the real answer finally came to me. I looked at him and said, "Loving someone doesn't always mean you still see them." The second the words left my mouth, I knew it was true. Ethan frowned slightly, trying to understand, so I continued. I told him how when his dad and I first got married, he noticed absolutely everything. If I looked tired, he'd ask to cook dinner. If I had a headache, he'd tell me to lie down while he folded the laundry. He used to bring me tea without me ever having to ask. I smiled at the memory, telling Ethan that his dad wasn't perfect, but he paid attention. Then I took a slow breath and explained how life just got busy. There was work, school events, college tuition, aging parents, and a house that always needed something. Little by little, he stopped asking. I wasn't trying to blame David, and honestly, I don't think he even noticed the shift. I told Ethan it wasn't because he stopped loving me. He just started assuming I was always going to be okay. Ethan lowered his eyes and admitted that he thought he had done the exact same thing. I reached over, squeezed his hand, and told him no, that he was just a kid. But as I stopped myself from finishing the sentence about his father, I realized something surprising. Even now, after everything, my very first instinct was still to protect David. Ethan looked at me and asked a simple yet heavy question. So, what do you want? I'd never really asked myself that. Did I want revenge? No. Did I want to embarrass him in front of his family? Absolutely not. Did I want to leave him? The answer came immediately. I smiled and told Ethan that I didn't want to leave his father. I still love him. I've loved him for almost 30 years, and I truly believe he still loves me too. Ethan nodded and asked again, "Then what do you want?" I looked up toward the bedroom window where I could see David's shadow moving around. For a split second, I remembered the young man who used to dance with me while we washed dishes in our first tiny apartment. The man who once drove across town at 10 o'clock at night just because I casually mentioned craving strawberry ice cream. That man hadn't disappeared. He'd simply been buried beneath decades of routine. I swallowed the lump in my throat and told Ethan, I just want him to remember something. Ethan quietly asked what, and I said, I want him to remember that I'm part of this family too. I'm not just the machine that keeps it running. I'm someone who gets tired, someone who gets sick, and someone who sometimes needs to be taken care of. The words surprised even me. I hadn't realized how badly I needed to say them out loud, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, I felt myself breathe a little easier. Ethan sat in silence for a few seconds, then smiled and said he didn't think Dad had any idea. I nodded, agreeing completely. Another silence settled between us until Ethan leaned forward with a look in his eye. He glanced toward the house and asked, What if Dad had to do everything you've been doing? I laughed softly and said he'd survive. But Ethan shook his head. He meant everything. Planning where everyone stays, buying groceries, cooking, laundry, keeping track of everybody, the whole thing. That definitely caught my attention, and I told him I was listening. Ethan reminded me that I'd been talking for 2 years about replacing the old floors and fixing the electrical wiring, but I kept putting it off because someone else always needed something first. Then he paused and asked, So, what if now is finally the time? I blinked, realizing what he meant, and muttered, The contractors? Ethan nodded, pointing out that if the house is actively under renovation, no one can stay here. I looked at him without saying a word as the idea settled between us. It wasn't cruel or dishonest, it was just reality. David would have to find hotel rooms, coordinate everyone's schedules, answer every single phone call, and solve every little problem that normally landed on my shoulders before anyone even realized it existed. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because for the first time in nearly 30 years, he might finally experience exactly what I'd been quietly carrying all this time. I looked at Ethan, and for the first time since my surgery, I let out a real, genuine laugh. Not because I was happy, but because for the first time, I could actually see a way forward. Maybe this was never about teaching my husband a lesson. Maybe it was just about giving him the chance to finally see me again. The next morning, I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't sadness. It was pure clarity. For the first time since my surgery, I wasn't thinking about how to make everyone else's life easier. Instead, I was thinking about something I had been postponing for nearly 2 years. The house needed repairs, real repairs, the kind I'd kept pushing aside because someone else always seemed to need something more. Every single year, I'd tell myself, maybe this fall, or maybe after Christmas. But there was always another reason to wait. Lily needed help with wedding expenses. David's parents needed a new water heater. Ethan's college textbooks cost more than expected, or the roof needed attention. It was one thing after another, one person after another. And every time I told myself the same thing: it can wait. But that morning, sitting alone with my tea, I finally understood something. It wasn't just the house that had been waiting, so had I. I picked up my phone and called the renovation company whose estimate had been sitting in my desk drawer for almost 2 years. The receptionist sounded surprised and asked, "So you'd like to move forward with the project?" I told her yes, as soon as possible. As luck would have it, a crew had just opened a weekend slot and they could start immediately. That weekend, the exact weekend David's parents were coming to stay. For a moment, I almost laughed. The timing was too perfect. It felt less like a coincidence and more like life quietly giving me a chance to finally choose myself. When I hung up, Ethan walked into the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of tea. He looked at me for a second, smiled, and said, "You did it, didn't you?" I smiled back and told him I did. He glanced toward the phone and asked when they start. "This Saturday," I said. His eyebrows lifted as he realized what that meant, and he said, "The same day Grandma and Grandpa arrive?" I nodded. For a moment, neither of us said anything, and then we both just laughed, not because we were trying to punish anyone, and not because we wanted revenge. The timing was simply unbelievable. Over the next 2 days, Ethan became my partner in a way I hadn't expected. My son had always been kind, but somewhere between leaving for college and coming home that summer, he had quietly become a man. He called the renovation company to confirm the schedule, and he helped me pack clothes and medications into small bags because I still wasn't allowed to lift anything heavy. When I bent down to move a storage box, he immediately stopped me and said, "Mom, I've got it." Those 4 words almost brought me to tears, not because they were extraordinary, but because I couldn't remember the last time someone had said them to me. The hospital arranged a short-term recovery apartment for patients who needed a quiet place to heal after surgery. It wasn't luxurious, just a clean, furnished apartment 15 minutes away, with a small kitchen, a comfortable bed, and a balcony overlooking a quiet park. It was exactly what I needed. On Friday afternoon, Ethan drove me there. Before leaving, he carried in my suitcase and checked the room one more time. He asked me to promise to call if I needed anything, and I told him I would. He hugged me carefully, avoiding my stitches, and said, "I'm proud of you, Mom." I froze for a second. No one had ever told me they were proud of me for resting. I'd always been praised for giving more, doing more, and sacrificing more, never for choosing myself. After Ethan left, I stood alone on the balcony. For the first time in years, there was nothing waiting for me. No grocery list, no meals to plan, no rooms to clean, and no one asking for something. There was only silence, and strangely, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. The next morning, before the renovation crew arrived, I drove past our house one last time. The early sunlight stretched across the front porch, and the flower beds I'd planted every spring were beginning to bloom. The maple tree David and I planted when Ethan was born was now taller than the roof. I sat in my car for a long moment. That house had witnessed almost every chapter of our lives: birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, family dinners, arguments, apologies, laughter, and tears. It had sheltered everyone I loved. But as I looked at it that morning, I realized something. For nearly 30 years, I had spent my life repairing everyone else's comfort. Maybe it was finally time to repair my own, the house and the woman living inside it. Around noon, the first contractor's truck pulled into the driveway, and minutes later, another arrived. Workers unloaded lumber, protective sheets, toolboxes, and equipment, and the loud sound of power tools quickly filled the neighborhood. Within an hour, our front entrance looked less like a home and more like a massive construction site. Then David called. I answered on the second ring, and his voice sounded completely confused as he asked, "Claire, where are you?" I told him I was at the recovery apartment. He asked what happened to the house, and I told him the renovation started today. There was a long pause before he muttered, "What renovation?" I told him it was the one I've been planning for almost 2 years. Another silence followed before he said, I I didn't know it was happening this weekend. I simply replied, I know. He said, Mom and Dad are pulling into the neighborhood right now. And again, I said, I know. Then he panicked a little, saying, the contractor said nobody can stay inside. I told him, I know. His breathing changed, and he asked, but where are they supposed to go? I closed my eyes. For once, I didn't feel the need to explain myself or defend my choice. I just told him the truth. I said, the house needs to heal, David. I paused for a beat and then added softly, and so do I. I wish I could tell you that David understood everything the moment he hung up the phone. He didn't, at least not at first. For the first few hours, David did exactly what he had always done. He tried to fix everything because solving problems was the only role he knew how to play. Only this time, the problems weren't quietly waiting for me to handle them. They were entirely his. His parents arrived first. Richard stepped out of the passenger seat, rubbing his lower back after the long drive from Indiana. At 79, he still insisted on driving whenever he could, even though Eleanor usually convinced him to let her take over halfway. 20 minutes later, Susan and Mark arrived with their 2 teenagers, and everyone just stopped dead at the end of the driveway. The front porch was completely covered in yellow caution tape, plastic sheets covered the windows, and the loud echo of drills vibrated from inside the house. For several seconds, nobody knew what to say. David forced a small smile and muttered that he guessed they were staying somewhere else. And right then, reality hit hard. The next few hours became one massive headache after another. Another phone call, another request, another small problem that somehow became David's sole responsibility. None of those things were difficult on their own, but together they just never stopped. The hardest part wasn't even the physical work. It was the realization that there was always something else waiting. And then came the comments. They weren't cruel comments or intentional criticism, just simple observations from people who had spent decades depending on me. Richard would smile and say that Claire usually remembers to bring extra blankets. Eleanor would look around the breakfast table and add that Claire always packs fruit for the road. Susan would open a grocery bag and note that Claire usually buys the unsweetened almond milk. Even Mark would laugh and mention that Claire always remembers his bacon. Nobody was trying to make David feel inadequate. They were only describing what had always been their normal. But for David, every single sentence landed like a blow. Claire usually, Claire always, Claire remembers. For the very first time, David understood that those weren't just compliments. They were proof. They were proof of how much I had been carrying without a single person noticing. By the 4th day, I could hear the pure exhaustion in David's voice whenever we spoke. He still asked about my recovery and told me not to worry, but something had fundamentally shifted. His voice was slower, quieter, like he was finally seeing the massive weight I had carried for years. Meanwhile, for the first time in decades, I wasn't responsible for a single soul. Every morning, I made myself 1 cup of Earl Grey tea, just one, and it was entirely mine. I read books that had been sitting unfinished on my shelf for years, walked slowly through the park behind the recovery apartment, and took long naps without feeling an ounce of guilt. And something truly surprised me. I stopped apologizing for resting. For nearly 30 years, rest had felt selfish. Now it just felt necessary. One evening, Ethan called and told me I sounded different, that I sounded peaceful. I looked out at the trees moving outside my window and realized I had completely forgotten what peaceful even felt like. A few days later, David stopped by the house after the contractors had gone home to grab some files from his office. The renovation was in full swing. The floors were completely ripped up, plastic sheets hung from the ceilings, and dust covered every square inch of the furniture. Later on, David told me the silence inside that house felt incredibly strange, almost unfamiliar. While searching through the cabinet beside my desk, he stumbled upon an old brown notebook hidden way behind a stack of photo albums. At first, he thought it was just one of my reading journals, but it wasn't. Every single page was filled with meticulous notes. Richard, decaf coffee, blood pressure medication, favorite pie. Eleanor, no spicy food, extra blanket in the guest room. Susan, unsweetened almond milk, birthday gift ideas. Mark, extra crispy bacon, medium t-shirts. Tyler, peanut allergy, emergency medication, favorite baseball team. It went on page after page, year after year. Christmas gifts, flight schedules, wedding anniversaries, medication refills, favorite breakfasts, hotel preferences. It held every tiny detail about everyone we loved, 20 years of memories, written entirely in my handwriting. David kept turning the pages, and everyone was in there. His parents, his family, our children, even their friends. But then he finally reached the very last page, and it was completely blank. There wasn't a single note about me. Not my favorite tea, not my birthday, not the books I loved or the flowers that made me smile. Nothing at all. David sat straight down on the dusty living room floor, holding the notebook in his hands while the house stood completely silent. For the first time in nearly 30 years, there was no one there quietly taking care of everyone else, just a husband sitting alone with the invisible life his wife had carried for decades. And as he stared at those empty pages, David finally understood. The person who had remembered everything about everyone had slowly disappeared from everyone's memory, and for the first time in years, he cried. Later, David told me he didn't know how long he'd been sitting there on the dusty living room floor. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 30. Time no longer felt real. The old notebook rested in his hands, open to that final blank page, a page that somehow carried more meaning than all the pages before it. Then the front door clicked open. It was Ethan, who had stopped by after visiting me at the recovery apartment. The contractors had already left for the day, and he wanted to make sure everything at the house was secure before they returned the next morning. He called out into the house, "Dad?" But there was no answer. Ethan followed the heavy silence into the living room, and that's when he saw him. David was still sitting flat on the floor, the notebook resting in his lap. His eyes were red, and his shoulders looked heavier than Ethan had ever seen them. Ethan didn't even ask what happened. He just looked at the notebook, then looked at his father, and he already understood. Without saying a single word, Ethan walked over and sat down right beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, David broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper as he asked, "When did your mom start writing all of this?" Ethan looked down at the notebook and said he honestly didn't know. He ran his fingers over the worn leather cover and murmured, maybe when I was still a kid." David slowly turned another page, then another. each one holding pieces of someone else's life: favorite meals, medication schedules, birthdays, gift ideas, flight numbers, anniversary reminders. Tiny details most people forgot within minutes, Claire had remembered every single one for years. David stopped turning the pages, his voice cracking completely as he said, "I never knew. I never knew she carried all of this." Ethan nodded quietly, saying he knew. David looked up at him and asked, "Why didn't she ever tell me?" Ethan answered without a second thought, "Because Mom never wanted people to notice what she did." David frowned, asking what he meant, and Ethan looked around the half-finished living room. He explained that Mom didn't want Grandma thanking her, she didn't want Aunt Susan apologizing, and she didn't want anyone feeling like they owed her something. He paused and said, "That's just not who she is." David lowered his eyes, and the notebook suddenly felt 100 times heavier in his hands. After a long silence, Ethan spoke again, looking directly at his father. He told him that the person Mom wanted to notice her was never everyone else. It was you. The room became completely, utterly still. Outside, the distant echo of a hammer drifted from another house down the street. But inside, there was only silence. David swallowed hard, saying, "I love your mother. I've always loved her. I never wanted her to feel alone." Ethan didn't sound angry or disappointed. He just spoke the plain truth. He told his dad that he'd never once doubted his love for Mom, but then he continued softly, reminding him that Mom is his family too. Those words landed harder than either of them expected, because no one had ever said that to David before, not because it wasn't true, but because everyone just assumed he already knew. Ethan looked back down at the notebook and said, "You've spent years taking care of Grandma and Grandpa. You worked hard for us. You worried about my tuition, about Lily, about your employees, about your customers. You carried a lot." David whispered back, "I know." Ethan took a long, shaky breath, looked at his father, and said, "But somewhere along the way, you forgot about the person carrying you." David's hands began to tremble. For the very first time, he wasn't just remembering what I had done, he was remembering who I had been. He suddenly saw a young woman sitting on the front porch of their first tiny apartment, reading a novel in the warm afternoon sun. Back then, he would sit beside her every single Sunday, and sometimes they barely spoke because they didn't need to. He remembered stopping at a small tea shop after work just because he knew Claire loved Earl Grey with lemon, bringing it home just to surprise her. He remembered grocery shopping together during their first years of marriage, how Claire always reached out for his hand before they crossed the parking lot, and how he always held it without a second thought. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped. Not because he stopped loving her, not because he chose someone else, and not because he stopped caring. Life simply became louder. Work got busier, the kids grew older, his parents needed more help, and responsibilities just kept piling up. And every single time Claire quietly handled one more thing, David started believing she didn't need anything from him. Not because she wasn't important, but because he truly believed she would always just be there. That realization broke something deep inside him. A tear rolled down his face, and then another. Within seconds, Ethan watched his father cry harder than he had ever seen in his entire life. Not tears of embarrassment or frustration, but the kind of tears that come when someone finally sees a painful truth they spent years missing. Ethan didn't interrupt. He simply sat right there beside his father, the exact same way I had sat beside David countless times throughout our marriage. After several minutes, David took a long, shaky breath. He carefully closed the notebook, placed his hand on the worn cover, wiped his eyes, and slowly stood up. Ethan looked up and called out, "Dad," But David just managed a small, sad smile. He told Ethan he needed to go somewhere. He didn't explain where, and he didn't have to. For the first time in a very long time, he knew exactly who he needed to see.
David didn't come to see me right away. He didn't stop at a florist, he didn't buy jewelry, and he didn't search for a perfect apology hidden inside an expensive gift. Instead, he went straight to the grocery store. For the first time in years, he walked slowly through every single aisle, not thinking about what everyone else needed, but thinking entirely about what I liked. He stood in front of the tea shelf for almost a full minute until a small smile appeared on his face. He whispered, "Earl Grey, I remember," and placed a box into the cart. Then he picked up the buttery shortbread cookies I always reached for, but rarely bought because someone else usually wanted something different. At the soup aisle, he stopped again, looking at the canned soups for a moment before shaking his head. He smiled softly and murmured, "No, Claire likes homemade chicken soup." So he filled the cart with fresh vegetables, chicken broth, herbs, carrots, celery, and onions, not because he was trying to make a grand gesture, but because he was finally paying attention. Near the checkout, he passed the flower section, and he didn't choose the biggest bouquet. He chose white tulips, my absolute favorite, the flowers I hadn't received in years. An hour later, there was a gentle knock on the door of my recovery apartment. When I opened it, David was standing there with 2 heavy grocery bags and a bouquet of white tulips. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he gave a nervous smile, lifted the bag slightly, and said, "I thought today you should sit. I'll cook." I must have looked completely shocked because he laughed quietly and added, "I know, I've probably forgotten how." He wasn't wrong. A few minutes later, he opened 3 different drawers before finding the chef's knife, and then he stood in front of the cabinets completely confused, asking where I keep the soup pot. I pointed toward the cabinet above the refrigerator, and a minute later, he came back holding 3 different pots, looking at them seriously as he asked which one was actually the soup pot. I couldn't help but smile. Watching David struggle with the little things I'd done without thinking for decades was strangely comforting. He chopped carrots into pieces of completely different sizes, some paper thin, some big enough to belong in a giant stew. The onions made him tear up before the emotions did, and twice he reached for ingredients that weren't there before remembering we weren't in our own kitchen. The soup turned out too salty, and the bread stayed in the oven a little too long, coming out slightly burnt around the edges. But for the first time in days, I laughed. Not at him, but with him, because he wasn't pretending anymore. He was finally seeing how much effort had always been hidden inside ordinary moments. When we finally sat down to eat, neither of us cared that the meal wasn't perfect. After a few quiet bites, David placed his spoon down, and his eyes met mine. He told me he found my notebook. My hand stopped, and for a moment the room became completely still. David looked down at the table before continuing, his voice getting quieter as he admitted he read every page, and that he realized something. He took a slow breath and said, "I remembered almost none of it." He looked at the notebook sitting beside him and said, "You spent years remembering everything for everyone. I knew what my father liked, I knew what my mother liked, and I knew what the kids liked, because you always remembered first. I thought those details just appeared somehow. I never stopped to ask who was carrying them." He reached across the table and took my hand, his voice trembling as he said, "I never stopped loving you, Claire. I just forgot how much you needed someone to take care of you, too. I'm sorry." The words stayed between us, quiet, heavy, and real. After a long moment, he whispered, "Can you forgive me?" I looked at him for a long time and told him I already did. He blinked, and I gently squeezed his hand, explaining that forgiveness was never the hardest part.
The hardest part was believing that he finally saw me. Neither of us spoke after that. He just held my hand a little tighter, the exact same way he used to 30 years ago. I smiled through the tears that finally came, not because my heart was breaking, but because for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't carrying everything alone. Outside the window, the evening sun disappeared behind the trees, leaving the sky painted with soft gold. For the first time in nearly 30 years, it wasn't me taking care of David, and it wasn't David trying to take care of everyone else. It was simply two people finally finding each other again.